A father takes his estranged son on a hike to fix their relationship, but returns from the mountain alone with a story full of lies, triggering an intense psychological battle with investigators that is suddenly shattered when a 100-year-old journal reveals the father isn't the killer. The real monster has been hunting on that mountain for 30 years. The silence of a home can tell a story, not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping house, but the other kind, the loud kind, the kind that screams with words no one has the courage to say. And in the Vance family home, on what would become the last normal morning of their lives, the silence was deafening. It began, as it often did, in the kitchen. In fact, the kitchen was like a stage where the same sad play was performed every day. David Vance stood at the counter, a man built like a fortress, all sharp angles and rigid control. He measured coffee grounds with the precision of a scientist because it was a small piece of the world he could command. Every morning, he commanded it. First the scoop, then the level, then the tap. His wife, Sarah, moved around him like a gentle stream flowing around a stubborn rock. She hummed a tune that had no melody, a nervous habit she'd picked up years ago. Her movements were quick and light, a frantic dance to fill the space his silence created. She was trying to build a morning out of cheerfulness and buttered toast, but the foundation was cracked. And then, there was Ethan, 16 years old, and already a master of disappearance. He sat at the kitchen table, but he wasn't really there. His body was a hollow shape in a gray hoodie, his face hidden by the shadow of the hood, his soul lost somewhere in the bright blue glow of his phone. Soon after Sarah placed a plate of eggs in front of him, she tried to breach the wall. "It's a beautiful day for your hike," she said, her voice a little too bright. "The sun's supposed to be out all afternoon." Ethan didn't look up. Instead, he grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. David's coffee maker finished with a final gurgling sigh, and then he turned, his mug held tight in his hand. "You hear your mother, Ethan? Get off that phone. You need to be present." His voice wasn't mean, not exactly. More importantly, it was heavy like a stone, and it landed with a thud in the quiet room. He believed in being present, in facing things head-on. Maybe it was fear that drove him, the memory of a mistake he made long ago in another life, in a uniform he no longer wore. A time when not being present had cost someone everything. He didn't know what haunted him more, that memory, or the ghost sitting at his own kitchen table. Ethan finally looked up, his eyes flat and empty. "Yeah, I heard. This trip is important," David continued, his gaze unwavering. "It's about more than just a walk in the woods. It's about clearing your head. It's about remembering what matters." Truth be told, the trip was an ultimatum. It was a last-ditch effort to reclaim a son he felt was slipping away like sand through his fingers. A son whose room he had searched just 2 nights before, his hands shaking with a fury he didn't know he had, until he found the small deadly pills tucked away in a sock drawer. That's why this hike felt so heavy with unspoken meaning. Sarah, sensing the shift in the air, tried to steer them back to safety. "He knows, David. Don't push." She looked at her husband, and for a fleeting moment, her cheerful mask slipped. "He's a boy, not a recruit." The words hung in the air, a rare challenge. And just like that, everything changed. David's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he just nodded, a sharp, angry dip of his chin. The battle was over for now. As if time had frozen, the three of them stood in their own private bubbles of resentment and grief and fear. A few minutes later, Ethan scraped his chair back and stood up. He grabbed his backpack from the floor without another word. He was ready to go. Sarah's heart felt like it was being squeezed. She remembered when he was 6, how he'd bounce on his toes before these hikes, his face bright with excitement, asking a million questions about what animals they might see. Now, he just looked like a stranger leaving for a place she couldn't follow. Because of that, a deep ache settled behind her ribs. As Ethan walked toward the door, he pulled out his phone one last time. A breath later, a tiny secret smile touched his lips. an expression so foreign on his face that Sarah almost didn't recognize it. It was a chilling thought, but in that moment, she realized he wasn't just escaping his father. He was running to something else entirely. She wanted to call out, to ask him to wait, to tell him she loved him one more time, but the words got stuck in her throat. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong. So she just watched as David followed him out, the door clicking shut behind them, leaving her alone in the loudest silence she had ever known. The quiet that settled after they left was a liar. It wasn't peace. It was the sound of a held breath, the silence of a fuse burning down to its end. Sarah cleaned the kitchen, and then she vacuumed the living room. After that, she scrubbed a bathroom that was already spotless. She did it all because the routine was a shield against the thoughts that circled her mind like vultures. What was happening on that mountain? What words were being said? Would her son come back to her, or would he retreat even further away? No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the image of Ethan's secret smile. It was a lock on a door she didn't have the key to. The hours crawled by. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. The sun that had been so bright that morning began to hide behind a gathering of gray, moody clouds. A wind kicked up, rattling the windows. A storm was rolling in off Sparrow Ridge. At the same time, a storm was brewing inside Sarah's chest. Her anxiety, a low hum all day, was now a pounding drum. He should have called by now, she thought. David always called when the weather turned. With every heartbeat, her fear grew stronger. At 4:12 p.m., her phone finally rang, the sound ripping through the quiet house like a gunshot. Her heart dropped. She snatched it off the counter, her hands trembling. David? But the voice on the other end of the line was wrong. It was ragged and broken and hollow. It was the voice of a man who had walked through hell and left part of himself behind. It was her husband's voice, yet it wasn't. This was the voice of a stranger wearing his name, a harbinger of a nightmare from which she would never wake up. The call ended, but the silence that followed was 1,000 times worse than the one before. For a few seconds, Sarah Vance stood completely still in her kitchen, the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to a dead line. And then, her body remembered how to move. What followed was a clumsy, frantic rush for her keys, her coat, her sanity. She didn't remember the drive, only the blinding red and blue lights that cut through the darkening storm at the edge of the Sparrow Ridge National Park. She found David in a small, sterile room at the ranger station, a place that smelled of wet wool and antiseptic. A man can break a bone on a mountain, that's easy. But breaking a story that's already a lie? That's much harder. And then, David told his story. He sat on the edge of a small cot, a paramedic checking his blood pressure while his arm rested in a makeshift sling. His voice was flat and eerily calm as he described the hike. He said they were on the North Fork Trail. He told them about the sudden rock slide, a freak accident of shifting earth and stone. And then he described how he had fallen, how his shoulder had popped with a sickening sound, and how Ethan, her brave, capable Ethan, had insisted on going for help. He had gone for help. Those were the words he used, over and over, like a prayer. Because of that, Sarah clung to them. They were the only life raft in an ocean of terror. She believed him because she had to. Soon after, a woman walked into the room, and the air seemed to get a little thinner, a little colder. This was Sheriff Jenkins. She wasn't tall, but she took up space. She had tired, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and she carried a notepad like a weapon. She listened to David repeat his story without saying a word, her expression unreadable. After that, she turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Vance, I'm very sorry you're going through this," she said, and her voice was surprisingly gentle. "I had a friend whose son went missing on this very ridge about 10 years ago. They found him after 2 days. He'd just gotten turned around." She didn't say it to offer false hope. Instead, she said it because she wanted Sarah to know that she saw a mother, not just a witness. It was a small kindness in a room that felt like a cage. But then, She turned back to David, and her voice was all business again. "Which part of the North Fork Trail were you on when the slide happened?" "About 2 miles in," David said, his eyes fixed on a spot on the far wall, just past the old oak tree that was struck by lightning. "And which way did Ethan go for help?" Sheriff Jenkins asked, her pen scratching against the paper. "He went down," David said. "Down into the ravine. I told him to follow the creek bed. It would lead him right back to the main road." Sheriff Jenkins stopped writing. She looked up, and a flicker of something, maybe doubt, crossed her face. "He went down? Into the ravine?" "It was the fastest way," David insisted. "The trail back was blocked by the slide." The sheriff didn't press him further. Not yet. Instead, she promised a full-scale search would begin at first light. More importantly, she promised they would do everything they could. But as she walked out of the room, Sarah saw the look she gave her deputy. It was a look that said, "Something isn't right here." His world tilted. Come morning, the base of Sparrow Ridge was a flurry of activity. Search and rescue vans crowded the parking lot, their official logos looking small and helpless against the backdrop of the massive, indifferent mountain. The air was cold and sharp, and the team of volunteers listened intently as Sheriff Jenkins gave her briefing. Among them was an old man named Eli, who had been walking these trails for 50 years. His face was a road map of wrinkles, and he knew the mountain like the back of his own hand. As Jenkins detailed David's account of the rock slide and the path Ethan had supposedly taken, Eli quietly shook his head. He turned to the younger volunteer next to him. "A rock slide on the North Fork?" he muttered, his voice a low rumble. "Hasn't been a slide on that path in 20 years. Not since the big rains of '05. And nobody, I mean nobody, goes for help by climbing down into Miller's Ravine. That's a death trap. It's all tangled brush and steep drops. You stay high. You always stay high." To make things worse, the story didn't sit right with him, because the mountain didn't lie, even if people did. Meanwhile, back at her silent house, Sarah's mind was a storm of its own. She found herself standing in Ethan's bedroom, her hand resting on the bright orange backpack that was now at the center of a manhunt. She remembered buying it for him last summer. "It's so bright," he had complained, the way teenagers do. "That's the point," she had joked, trying to make him smile. "It's so I can always spot you, even from a mile away." Now the memory was a knife twisting in her gut. She had wanted to be able to see him, to keep him safe. And now he was gone. Hours passed. The search teams combed the woods, their bright jackets dotting the mountainside. Their calls of Ethan were swallowed by the vast, empty wilderness. The hope that had been a tiny flame in the morning began to flicker and fade with the afternoon sun. David sat at the command post, a map spread out before him, his face a grim mask. He pointed to spots, offered suggestions, but his eyes were hollow. He was a man playing a part. And then, just as the day was beginning to feel lost, a crackle came over the radio. It was Eli's voice. "Sheriff, you're going to want to see this." He had found the backpack, but it was all wrong. It wasn't in the ravine or anywhere near the North Fork Trail. In fact, it was nearly 3 miles away, on a completely different part of the mountain. It wasn't dirty or torn or damaged from a fall. Instead, it was propped neatly against the trunk of a giant pine tree, as if someone had carefully placed it there, as if it were a message. By the time Sheriff Jenkins arrived, a small group had gathered, their faces grim. The orange of the backpack was a scream of color in the muted greens and browns of the forest. With gloved hands, Jenkins carefully unzipped the main compartment. Everything inside seemed normal. A half-eaten granola bar, a full water bottle, a well-worn paperback novel. It all looked like the innocent belongings of any teenage boy. Her gut twisted, but then her fingers found a small hidden pocket on the inside, one designed for a wallet or keys. It wasn't empty. She reached in and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. As she unfolded it, a chilling silence fell over the small group. Her breath caught. It was a one-way bus ticket, a ticket to Portland, Oregon. and the date printed in stark black ink was for the day after the hike was supposed to end. And just like that, everything changed. The story of a tragic accident, of a brave son going for help, evaporated into the cold mountain air, and a new, ugly story began to take its place. A story of a runaway. Or worse. A story of a boy who was never meant to come home at all. A rock can kill you on a mountain, and a fall can break you. Yet a simple piece of paper, thin and flimsy enough to float on the wind, that can bury you alive. After Sheriff Jenkins found the bus ticket, the air on Sparrow Ridge changed. It was no longer filled with the frantic energy of a search. Instead, a cold, heavy suspicion descended with the evening fog. The ride back down the mountain was silent, but David Vance could feel the weight of that ticket, secured in an evidence bag on the seat between them, pressing down on him, suffocating him. Back at the ranger station, the gentle sympathy was gone. In fact, the room now felt like a cage. Sheriff Jenkins placed the plastic bag containing the ticket on the metal table. It sat there, small and ordinary, yet it seemed to pull all the light in the room toward it. "Can you explain this, Mr. Vance?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. David stared at it as if it were a snake. "That's not his," he said, his voice a little too quick, a little too loud. "It's a mistake. Someone must have planted it in his bag." His eyes darted toward Sarah, pleading with her to believe him. He loved his life here. He had no reason to leave. Sarah, who had been a pillar of numb support, finally crumbled. She looked at her husband, her eyes filled with a new, terrifying confusion. "Is that what you think, David?" she whispered, and her voice cracked open the fragile piece. "Did you really think he was happy?" The question stunned David into silence. It was the first crack in their united front, a jagged line that exposed years of unspoken truths. He had no answer. Because of that, Sheriff Jenkins knew she had him. She leaned forward, her voice soft but sharp as a razor. "Your son was unhappy enough to plan a secret trip across the country, Mr. Vance. So, I'm going to ask you again. What happened on that mountain?" David's face hardened into a mask of anger. It was his last defense. "I told you. There was a rock slide. He went for help." He spat the words out, but they sounded hollow now, echoes of a story no one in the room believed anymore. His body tensed on instinct. The investigation shifted. What followed was a deep dive into the life of David Vance. At the sheriff's station, the case was no longer a missing hiker. Instead, a new file was started. The name on it was Ethan Vance, but the subject was his father. "He's hiding something big," Jenkins said to her deputy, a young, eager officer named Mills. "Dig into him. His finances, his phone records, his history. I want to know everything about this man. See what shakes loose." So, Mills started digging. At first, there was nothing. David Vance had a clean record. He paid his taxes. He had no history of violence. He was, on paper, a model citizen. But then, Mills looked into his military service. "Sheriff," he said, walking into her office later that night, "Vance doesn't have a criminal record, but his military discharge, it's not dishonorable, but it's not clean either." He slid a thin file across her desk. "There was an incident, a training exercise in a mountain range just like Sparrow Ridge. The report says Vance was the team leader. He made a call, pushed his men too hard, ignored the warning signs of an approaching storm because he was determined to meet the objective." The tension snapped. "What happened?" Jenkins asked, her eyes scanning the document. "One of the younger soldiers slipped," Mills said quietly. "Fell into a crevasse. By the time they got to him, it was too late. The report calls it a fatal lapse in judgment on Vance's part. No charges were filed, but his career was over. They said his obsession with control and success made him blind to the real dangers." Sheriff Jenkins leaned back in her chair, the new information settling into place. A man with a history of pushing too hard in the mountains. A man whose bad judgment had already led to one death. A man obsessed with control who was now losing it. The signs were always there. Meanwhile, the Vance house was no longer a home. It was a tomb, haunted by the ghost of their missing son and the suffocating presence of lies. Sarah finally confronted David, her voice shaking with a mix of grief and rage. "Why did you lie to me, David? You lied about him being happy. What else are you not telling me? What really happened when you two were alone?" "I'm not lying," he insisted, but he couldn't look her in the eye. Instead, he paced the living room like a caged animal. "You should be on my side, Sarah. They're trying to twist this, to make it my fault." "And is it?" she cried. "Is it your fault?" His silence was her answer. Something inside him caved. That night, Sarah felt a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache. After David had retreated into his study, she pulled out an old photo album. There they were, younger, smiling. David without the hard lines around his eyes. Her, with a genuine, carefree laugh. And then there were the pictures of Ethan as a little boy, all freckles and bright eyes, holding his father's hand. She traced their faces with her finger, and a terrible question rose in her mind. Had any of it been real? Had she spent 20 years loving a man she never really knew at all? Back at the sheriff's station, the investigation had hit a wall. David wasn't talking. The search had yielded no other clues. Frustration hung heavy in the air. Jenkins stood staring at a large map of Sparrow Ridge, the vast empty wilderness mocking her. And then, the phone rang. Mills picked it up. His posture straightened. "Sheriff, you need to hear this," he whispered, covering the mouthpiece. "Anonymous tip. Kid's voice. He sounds terrified." Jenkins nodded, and Mills put the call on speaker. A shaky, muffled voice filled the quiet room, a ghost on the line. You're looking for the boy," the voice whispered. "The one who went missing on the ridge." "Yes," Jenkins said, her voice calm and steady. "What do you know?" There was a pause, a sound of a sharp intake of breath. "Ask the father," the voice trembled. "Ask him about the old man's folly mine." And then, with a click, the line went dead. The silence that rushed back in was heavy with meaning. Jenkins slowly turned her gaze back to the map on the wall. Her finger traced the trails, the creeks, the contour lines, and then it stopped. It stopped on a tiny symbol, almost hidden in a remote, inaccessible part of the mountain, miles from any official path. A symbol for an abandoned mine. A mine David Vance, the experienced hiker, the man who knew this area, had never once mentioned. In the echo of that dead-end call, the case had just found a new, dark path to follow. A path that led directly back to a liar and his secrets. Every investigation has a place. A dark room, a locked basement, an unmarked grave. A place where all the lies and secrets are stored, waiting. For the disappearance of Ethan Vance, that place was a hole in the side of a mountain, a forgotten wound in the earth called the old man's folly. After the anonymous call, the name hung in the air at the sheriff's station like a ghost. It wasn't on any tourist map, and it wasn't a place anyone would go by accident, which meant it was a place someone would go on purpose. That's why Sheriff Jenkins found herself on the Vance family's doorstep well after dark, with the wind beginning to howl outside. The approaching storm was a physical threat, a promise of snow that would bury any and all evidence. And then, she confronted David. The air in the living room was thick enough to choke on. "Mr. Vance, we received a tip," she began, her voice leaving no room for argument. "About an abandoned mine. The old man's folly. Why didn't you mention it?" David didn't even flinch. He was a masterful liar, because he built his lies on a foundation of twisted truth. "Because I was afraid this would happen," he said, his voice a performance of pained fatherly concern. "I knew Ethan was fascinated by those old stories about that place. I forbid him from ever going near it. It's dangerous. Truth be told, I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to think my son was reckless enough to disobey me." He looked at Jenkins, his eyes pleading. I was trying to protect his memory. It was a brilliant pivot. He turned his deception into an act of love. Sarah, standing by the fireplace, looked like a ship lost in a fog, her face a blank canvas of confusion and despair. She wanted to believe him. More importantly, she needed to. Because if he was lying about this, what other, bigger lies were hiding behind his eyes? She felt it. Something wasn't right. The next morning, the urgency was a sharp, biting wind. A major blizzard was set to hit Sparrow Ridge in less than 24 hours. This meant they had one last, desperate window of opportunity. So, Jenkins briefed a specialized search team, a group of grim-faced men who understood the dangers of unstable, abandoned mines. "We have very little time," she told them, her breath misting in the cold air. "David Vance lied about this place, and I need to know why. Move fast, but move safe. I don't want to lose anyone else on this mountain." As the team headed up the ridge, a different kind of hunt was happening back at the station. A forensic tech, a young man with tired eyes, was running a deep recovery scan on Ethan's phone. He was looking for digital ghosts, the faint traces of data that get left behind even after a file is deleted. For hours, there was nothing. And then, he found it, a tiny, corrupted data fragment. He worked patiently, rebuilding it piece by piece. A breath later, his own breath caught in his throat. Moments later, his call to Sheriff Jenkins was filled with a strange, solemn energy. "Sheriff, we got something," he said, his voice low. "I recovered a deleted text message. It was sent from Ethan's phone at 7:10 a.m. the morning of the hike. It was sent to his best friend." "What did it say?" Jenkins asked, her knuckles white as she gripped her own phone. The tech took a deep breath before reading the words that would change everything. He said, "It says, 'Dad's on a rampage. If I'm not back by Sunday, tell them he knows where I went.'" The line went silent for a moment. This message completely destroyed David's story. This wasn't a bonding trip gone wrong. It was a confrontation. The phrase, "he knows where I went," was a breadcrumb, a clue left behind by a boy who suspected he might not return. The tech's voice came back softer now and full of a sad sort of wonder. "Sheriff, I read these things all the time. Last words, threats, goodbyes. This one feels different. It feels like a will. As if he knew he was being led somewhere he might not come back from." As if on cue, a call crackled over the radio from the search team on the mountain. The lead climber's voice was tense, fighting against the wind. "We're at the mine entrance. The boards have been pried loose. It looks like someone was here recently. We're preparing to go in." The rest of the afternoon was a long, agonizing wait. Jenkins and her team sat at the command post, listening to the static and the terse communications from the team. The first flakes of snow began to fall, soft and silent at first, then harder, angrier. The storm was coming. At the same time, David and Sarah waited in their home, trapped in a prison of silence. David paced, his face a mask of stone, while Sarah sat curled in a chair, staring out the window as the world turned white. His thoughts blurred. Finally, the radio crackled to life again. It was the voice of the rescuer who had been lowered into the blackness of the mine. His breathing was heavy, labored. "I'm at the bottom," he said. "It's a small chamber. There's a campsite down here. Looks recent. Food wrappers, a high-power flashlight." He paused, and the silence stretched for an eternity. "Sheriff, there's something else. There's something written on the wall." Jenkins leaned into the microphone, her heart pounding. "What is it, son? What does it say?" The rescuer's voice came back, strained and filled with a deep, unsettling confusion. The air felt heavier. "It's written in the dirt, 3 words. His voice cracked. It says, 'I'm sorry, Mom.' Sometimes the most devastating clue isn't a weapon or a body. It's a message. 3 words scrawled in the dirt, deep in the belly of a mountain, changed everything. "I'm sorry, Mom." It was a confession that accused no one, an apology that explained nothing, and a clue that pointed the entire investigation straight into a wall of blinding fog. As the blizzard finally descended on Sparrow Ridge, forcing the search teams into a frantic retreat, those 3 words echoed from the command post back to the Vance family home, shattering the fragile quiet. When Sheriff Jenkins delivered the news, her voice was heavy with a sorrow she couldn't hide. She told them what the rescuer had found, and then she watched as the 2 people at the heart of this storm processed the impossible. David Vance, the man of anger and iron control, simply deflated. The news seemed to punch the air out of his lungs, leaving behind a hollow, bewildered shell. The scenario was so far beyond the lies he had prepared that his mind had no place to put it. His fortress had crumbled. But Sarah's reaction was completely different. It was a surge of pure, primal defiance. "No," she said, her voice low and fierce, cutting through the room's heavy grief. "Absolutely not. You don't know my son. He was a fighter. He would get frustrated, he would get quiet, but he would never ever quit. On anything." Her eyes, red-rimmed and exhausted, flashed with a sudden fire. "Someone made him write that, or they wrote it themselves. My son did not do this." Her mother's instinct roared to life because it refused to accept a story where her child gave up. It was a rejection so total, so absolute, that it planted a new, wild seed of doubt in the sheriff's mind. Later that night, the station was a hive of weary frustration. The case was now a mess of contradictions. A runaway ticket, a threatening text from a father, and now a suicide note. Nothing made sense. The last of the search team was coming in from the cold, their faces grim with defeat. The lead rescuer, the one who had descended into the mine, approached Jenkins. He held out a large, sealed evidence bag. "We found this too, Sheriff," he said, his voice tired. It was wedged deep in a crack in the rock right next to where the message was written. Almost missed it in the dark. Inside the bag was a small, ancient object wrapped in oilcloth. It was a leather-bound journal, so old and fragile it looked like it might turn to dust if you breathed on it too hard. A chill rose on her skin. There was no doubt what it was. It was the prospector's journal, the very artifact that Ethan had been obsessed with, the supposed reason for his secret trip to the mine. But what was it doing there, after 100 years, waiting next to a message of modern despair? It felt wrong. It felt like a prop, carefully placed on a stage. With painstaking care, Jenkins and her deputy Mills opened the journal under a bright lamp. The ink on the pages was faded, the handwriting a looping, elegant script from another time. They read the entries aloud, the words of a lonely man searching for gold, complaining about the cold and the solitude. It was a sad, simple story, until they reached the very last page. The handwriting on this entry was different. It was shaky and frantic, the ink pressed hard into the paper. "What the hell does this say?" Mills muttered, leaning closer. Jenkins read the final words, her voice barely a whisper. "They will say the mountain took me, but it's not the fall that takes a man." She paused, her eyes widening as she deciphered the last, chilling phrase. "It's the one who stands and watches him go." The 2 officers stared at each other, the weight of those 100-year-old words settling in the room like a physical presence. "My God," Mills breathed. "What does that mean?" "It means the prospector wasn't alone," Jenkins said, her mind racing, connecting dots that shouldn't exist. "And it means we've been asking the wrong question all this time. We've been asking what happened between David and Ethan." She stood up and began to pace, her energy electric now. What if it wasn't just the 2 of them? What if there was a third person on that mountain? A watcher? The thought was so bizarre, so out of left field, that it should have been ridiculous. Yet it felt chillingly right. It was the only theory that could possibly hold all the broken pieces of this case. The runaway ticket, the father's lies, the son's fear, and a final desperate message in a cave. While the investigation was being turned on its head, David Vance was finally facing a truth of his own. The news of the note, The finality of the search being called off by the storm had been the last blows against his crumbling defenses. He was alone in his study, the room where he planned his contracts, where he commanded his small world. And then, he completely broke. It wasn't loud at first. It was a tremor that started in his hands. Then a sound escaped his lips. A raw, ragged sob that seemed torn from his soul. His anger, his pride, his lifetime of control. It all shattered in an instant. He swept a lamp off his desk, sending it crashing against the wall. He sank to his knees, his body racked with the kind of grief that is violent. "What did I do?" He wept, his words muffled by his hands. "Oh God, Ethan, what did I do?" It was not a confession to a crime. It was a confession of a deeper failure, the failure of a father who had pushed and pushed until his son had finally run to a place where he could not be reached. As David was being swallowed by his guilt, Sheriff Jenkins was being pulled deeper into the abyss of the past. The phrase from the journal, "the one who stands and watches," would not let her go. It felt like more than just a ghost story. On a pure gut feeling and instinct honed by 20 years of police work, she turned to Mills. "Pull the cold cases for Sparrow Ridge," she ordered. "Everything, not just murders. I want every missing person, every accidental fall, every John Doe found in those woods for the past 30 years. Mills, sensing the urgency in her voice, began pulling the old dusty files. One by one, he stacked them on her desk. A lone hiker who had accidentally fallen from a ledge in 2018. A college student who vanished while camping in 2009. A hunter whose remains were found at the bottom of a ravine in 1997. All different people, different years, but all with two things in common. They were alone, and they were on Sparrow Ridge. Jenkins stared at the pile of folders, a cold dread creeping up her spine. Her mind screamed. "It's a pattern," she whispered, her voice filled with a terrible awe. "This isn't about Ethan, not just about Ethan." She looked at Mills, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization. He wasn't just watching 100 years ago. He's been watching this mountain for decades, and we've been calling his victims accidents. A monster isn't something with claws and fangs. A real monster is a ghost who lives in the woods, a man who watches from the trees, a man who kills for decades and has his crimes dismissed as bad luck or clumsy accidents. And as Sheriff Jenkins stared at the stack of cold case files, each one a forgotten tragedy, she realized the ghost of Sparrow Ridge was real. What's worse, he had just taken another boy. The blizzard had locked the mountain down, a fortress of snow and ice. But inside the small sheriff's station, a firestorm of an investigation had begun. The air was thick with stale coffee and a new, terrifying urgency. "I want to know everything about these victims," Jenkins ordered, her voice sharp, cutting through the weary silence. "Who were they? What did they have in common? Were they all on the same trail? There has to be a link." The team scrambled, fueled by the horrifying new theory. This was no longer just about finding Ethan Vance. Instead, it was about hunting a phantom who had used their quiet little county as his personal graveyard for 30 years. They were hunting a ghost. And then, the ghost made a mistake. The phone rang. The call was patched through to Jenkins. On the other end of the line was a nervous man, his voice cracking with anxiety. I saw the news report," he stammered. "About the missing boy, Ethan. I run the late shift at the gas station over in Oak Haven, about 30 miles from the ridge." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "I think I saw him, the morning he went missing." Jenkins's instincts kicked in. "Tell me everything," she said. "He came in early," the man continued. "Bought a bottle of water and a map of the park, but he wasn't alone. He was with this older guy, a real mountain man type, you know? Long gray beard, quiet eyes, never said a word. The kid paid for everything." The man's story was a lightning strike, the first piece of solid human evidence in a case that had spiraled into ghost stories. Before anyone could speak, the first domino had fallen. Meanwhile, back in the silent, snowbound Vance house, Sarah was performing a mother's saddest ritual. She was cleaning Ethan's room, a desperate attempt to feel close to her son by touching the things he had touched. She folded his clothes, the scent of him still clinging to the fabric. She straightened the books on his desk. It was an act of grief, of surrender. But as she wiped down the wooden desk, her cloth snagged on something. A floorboard, right under where his chair always sat, was slightly loose. Curiosity, a strange and unwelcome feeling, nudged at her grief. So she knelt down and worked her fingers into the crack. The board lifted easily, and underneath, nestled in a small, hollowed-out space, was a stack of printed papers. They were emails. Her heart dropped. With trembling hands, she began to read. The screen names were unfamiliar: Escapist and Silas, her son, and a ghost. As her eyes flew across the pages, a secret world opened up before her, a world of coded messages about the old prospector, about the watcher on the mountain, about a plan to meet on the day of the hike, to find the journal, to uncover the truth together. The horror of it washed over her. Her son hadn't just run into a monster. He had sought him out. He had walked willingly into the arms of the ghost who haunted Sparrow Ridge. The ghost now had a name: Silas. A frantic, breathless phone call later, everything snapped into place for Sheriff Jenkins. The name Silas, combined with the gas station attendant's description, triggered a memory for a local historian the sheriff had called. Silas, the historian said. That was Silas Blackwood, a troubled family. Lived on the edge of the park. The boy vanished about 30 years ago, after a terrible family scandal. Everyone just assumed he ran off and died in the woods. But he hadn't died. He had stayed. He had become the ghost. He had become the watcher. The emails Sarah found contained one final critical clue: a hand-drawn map leading to a remote cabin deep in an uncharted section of the park. It was their only lead. Even as the blizzard raged, Jenkins assembled a small elite tactical team. They were going in. When they told David the news, the grief that had broken him now hardened into a cold, diamond-hard fury. "I'm going with you," he said, his voice flat and dangerous. Jenkins looked at the man, no longer a suspect, but a father with nothing left to lose. She saw the vengeance in his eyes. "You do exactly as I say," she warned, and he simply nodded. The journey to the cabin was a battle against the storm. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the snow was a blinding white curtain. But they found it. A small, dilapidated cabin, almost completely buried in snow. The silence around it was absolute. They breached the door and found it empty, a cold fire in the hearth, a single dirty plate on a table. He was gone. The air felt heavier. David's shoulders slumped in defeat. They were too late. And then one of the deputies circling the outside of the cabin called out. His voice was tight with dread. "Sheriff, over here." Behind the cabin, shielded from the wind, was a patch of earth where the snow had been disturbed. A mound. A shape that was horribly, undeniably familiar. It was a fresh, shallow grave. The space between facts burned. The despair that hit the team was a physical blow. This was it. The end of the road. The final, tragic resting place of Ethan Vance. As they began to secure the scene, preparing for the heartbreaking task of excavation, all hope died. But then, in the middle of that frozen, desolate hell, a miracle happened. Jenkins's satellite phone, a lifeline to the outside world, rang with a jarring chirp. It was the forensics lab. "Sheriff, you are not going to believe this," the tech said, his voice electric with an excitement that felt insane in that moment. "We've been going over the old prospector's journal with a fine-toothed comb. We found something, hidden in the spine. It's a tracker." "A what?" Jenkins breathed, her mind struggling to comprehend. "A tiny, low-power GPS tracker. A historical society that owned the journal decades ago put it in there in case it was ever stolen. It's been dormant for years, Sheriff. We thought it was dead." The tech paused for a dramatic beat. "It's not dead." Jenkins's heart stopped. She could barely form the words. Is it active?" The tech's voice was a shout of pure adrenaline. "That's why I'm calling, Sheriff. It just pinged. After all these years, it came online less than a minute ago. It's active, it's moving, and it's moving fast down the south side of the ridge, headed straight for the highway." The hunt for a ghost ends the moment he leaves a footprint. For 30 years, Silas Blackwood was a whisper in the woods, a phantom blamed for shadows and strange noises. But the moment he switched on a tiny GPS tracker hidden in the spine of a 100-year-old journal and stepped onto a paved road, the ghost story was over. And then, a police chase began. The shift was dizzying. One minute they were fighting a blizzard on a remote mountain, searching for a grave. The next, they were tearing down a clear highway, chasing a moving dot on a digital map. Inside Sheriff Jenkins's SUV, the energy was a raw, exposed nerve. She barked coordinates into her radio, coordinating with state troopers ahead. And beside her, David Vance was unnervingly calm. The rage that had consumed him had burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp point of focus. He wasn't a father seeking vengeance anymore. He was a man who needed an answer he could only get by looking into the eyes of the man who had been with his son at the end. His world tilted. The chase ended not with a bang, but with a strange, quiet surrender. The signal led them to a bus station 2 towns over, a sad, transient place that smelled of diesel and despair. And there he was. Silas. He was just an old man sitting on a bench looking tired, his hands resting on the ancient leather journal in his lap. He wasn't a monster. He was just old. When Jenkins and her tactical team surrounded him, guns drawn, he looked up with a kind of weary resignation, as if he had been waiting for them, as if he was tired of running from a world that had forgotten him decades ago. Without another word, he stood up and put his hands behind his back. What followed was not the defiant confession of a monster. Instead, in a small gray interrogation room, the ghost of Sparrow Ridge told his story, and it was a tragedy. "I didn't hurt him," Silas said, his voice soft and raspy from disuse. "He was my friend." He explained how he had found Ethan online, in forums dedicated to local legends. He said they were kindred spirits, 2 souls who felt lost in the modern world. He confirmed that Ethan had fought with his father. "The boy was angry," Silas said, looking at Jenkins with clear, sad eyes. "He ran to me because he had nowhere else to run. We were just going to find the old journal, that was the whole plan." But then, Silas's story took its final tragic turn. "We were up by the mine," he said, his gaze dropping to his hands. "We were arguing. I told him he had to go home, that he couldn't just run from his life. He got angry. He was yelling." Silas shook his head, a memory playing behind his eyes. He wasn't watching his feet. He just slipped. It happened so fast. 1 second he was there, yelling at me, and the next he was gone. He described his own panic, the terror of a man who had hidden from society for 30 years. He knew no one would ever believe it was an accident. He was a ghost, a recluse. They would call him a monster. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He hid the truth. "I buried him," he whispered, tears finally welling in his eyes. I thought it was the only kind thing to do, to give him a resting place." He admitted to writing the "I'm sorry, Mom" message on the cave wall, hoping it would lead police to believe it was a suicide, a tragedy that involved no one else. His story was coherent, it was plausible, and it was utterly heartbreaking. He was not a monster. He was just a lonely, paranoid man who had been caught in the middle of a family's collapse. Soon after, Sheriff Jenkins held a press conference. The lights were bright, the cameras flashed, but her face was grim. She announced that Silas Blackwood had been arrested in connection with the death of Ethan Vance. She said he had confessed and that the boy's death had been ruled the result of a tragic accident, with charges of unlawful disposal of a body and false imprisonment to follow. The case of the missing boy was officially closed. The ghost of Sparrow Ridge had been caught. David and Sarah watched the broadcast from their living room couch. The news they had prayed for, an answer to their nightmare, was finally here. Yet there was no relief on their faces. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness. The who had been found, but the why was a wound that would never heal. Later that night, sitting in the dark, Sarah spoke into the silence. "Do you believe him?" she asked, her voice fragile. David stared at the blank TV screen for a long time before he answered. "I don't know," he said, his voice heavy with a new kind of guilt. "He was just a boy, Sarah. Our boy. He was just looking for a friend." He finally looked at his wife, his eyes filled with a pain that was deeper than grief. "And I'm the one who drove him to him." Between them, the truth cracked open. Months passed. The seasons changed. Silas Blackwood was in prison. Ethan Vance was buried in the town cemetery. The world kept moving. But for David, time had stopped. One afternoon, he found himself back at the trailhead of Sparrow Ridge, staring up at the mountain that had taken everything from him. He was a man forever haunted. In his mind, he replayed Silas's confession over and over. It made sense. It fit all the facts. Almost all of them. But then, his thoughts snagged on the one detail that felt wrong, the one piece that didn't fit the puzzle of the tragic accident. He thought of the prospector's journal. He thought of that final, chilling line, written 100 years ago by another man who had died on this very mountain. As the wind shifted, the words echoed in his mind. "It's not the fall that takes a man. It's the one who stands and watches him go." Silas had confessed to being the one who stood there. He had confessed to watching. And David couldn't shake the one terrible question that he knew would follow him for the rest of his life. If it was all just a terrible, clumsy accident, why did the ghost's story sound so much like a reenactment of an ancient crime? They say a case is closed when a person is convicted and a report is filed. But for the people who live inside the story, a case is never truly closed. Instead, it's a room they can never leave. It's a question that echoes in the quiet moments of every day that follows. For David Vance, the echo was the sound of a boy falling and a man watching, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make it go away. The world moved on, as it always does. The snow on Sparrow Ridge melted, giving way to the green shoots of spring. Silas Blackwood accepted a plea deal, his confession painting him as a tragic, haunted figure, and he disappeared into the anonymity of the state prison system. The news cycle found new tragedies to devour. The town of Harmony Creek began to heal, but the Vance house remained a monument to a wound that would not mend. Eventually, a for sale sign was hammered into the front lawn, a final admission of defeat. Inside, Sarah moved through the rooms like a ghost, packing away a life into cardboard boxes. Each object she touched was a memory. A small, worn teddy bear from Ethan's crib. A framed photo of a smiling family on a beach trip years ago. A father, a mother, and a son who still belonged to them. She packed them all away with a quiet, heartbreaking deliberateness. She had decided she had to remember the boy she knew, not the mystery he had become. It was the only way she could survive. Because of that, she chose to build her future on the foundation of her happiest memories, not the rubble of the last few months. David, on the other hand, was obsessed with the rubble. He didn't help her pack. Instead, he sat for hours in his study, staring at a high-resolution photograph of the prospector's journal on his computer screen. He would zoom in on the last, spidery sentence, reading it over and over again. "It's not the fall that takes a man. It's the one who stands and watches him go." The words were a riddle with no answer, a lock with no key. He believed Silas's story most of the time. It was logical, and it made a sad kind of sense. But then he would look at this century-old sentence and the logic would crumble, leaving only a cold, terrifying doubt. He was a man chasing an echo, trying to find a truth that was likely buried with two men, 100 years apart on the same cursed mountain. On their last night in the house, they sat on the floor of the empty living room, surrounded by boxes that held the pieces of their broken life. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't angry. It was just sad and tired. "Are you going to be okay?" Sarah asked, her voice soft in the darkness. David stared at the wall, at the faint outline where a family portrait used to hang. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "Are you?" "I have to be," she said. "I have to remember him before all this, before Silas, before the arguments. I have to remember him at 6 with that gap in his teeth." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "That's the only way I can keep living." "I can't," David confessed, his voice thick with a guilt that had become a part of him. "I see his face, and then I see Silas's face. I hear the story about the fall, and then I hear the journal, the watcher." He finally looked at her, his eyes hollow. "The stories don't match, Sarah, and I think it's going to make me crazy." She reached out and placed her hand on his, a gesture not of romantic love, but of two survivors clinging to the same piece of wreckage. "Maybe," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe we're not supposed to know. Maybe that's our punishment. We just have to live with it." A year later, David was living in a different town, a smaller place where no one knew his name. He was working on a small construction crew, finding a strange comfort in the simple, honest work of building things. One afternoon, he was sitting on the tailgate of his truck during a lunch break when he saw the foreman's son, a boy of about 10, trying to hammer a nail into a piece of scrap wood. The boy was struggling, his face tight with frustration, his swings clumsy and ineffective. The old David Vance, the man of rigid control, would have marched over there, taken the hammer, and shown him the right way to do it with a gruff lecture. He would have imposed his will on the problem. But David was not that man anymore. Instead, he just watched for a long, quiet moment. Then he slowly got up and walked over. He didn't reach for the hammer. He just knelt down beside the boy. "You're holding it a little tight," he said, his voice quiet and gentle. "Like you're trying to force it. You have to let the tool do the work. Just guide it." The boy looked at him, then back at the nail. He loosened his grip, took a breath, and swung. The nail went in a little straighter. The boy looked up at David with a small, surprised smile. David just gave him a slight nod and walked away. It was a small act, a quiet moment. But it was everything. It was the legacy of his pain, a lesson learned at an impossible cost. He was still a father, but he had finally learned that a father's job wasn't to control, but to guide. The final images of this story are quiet ones. The swing set in the backyard of the old Vance house, its chains rusted, its seats empty. The boarded-up entrance to the old man's Folly mine, sealed now with concrete and steel, a tomb once more. A sterile gray prison cell, where Silas Blackwood sits on the edge of his bed, staring at a blank wall, his face revealing nothing. Is he a tragic man who made a terrible mistake, or a cunning predator who told one last perfect lie? The world will never know. But the story ends with David. He is a man who understands his own transformation, a man who will spend the rest of his life paying for it. In the quiet of the evening, his own voice echoes in his mind, a final, devastating confession to himself. The signs were always there, he thinks, the words a familiar, painful prayer. In the silence at dinner, in the way he wouldn't look at me. I was so busy trying to make him a man, I never stopped to ask my son what was wrong. He closes his eyes, but the image of Ethan's face is burned forever behind them. And then comes the question, the echo that will never fade, the question that is his life's sentence. What kind of father does that? While Silas was the one who was there at the end, this story began with a father and a son. It leaves us with a difficult but important question. How much responsibility does David Vance hold for what happened on that mountain? Did his pressure and anger set this tragedy in motion, regardless of Silas's involvement? This is a sensitive topic, so please discuss it with respect and empathy in the comments below. And as always, if you support our mission to explore the human element behind these haunting cases, please like and subscribe. We have another story coming next week that you won't want to miss. Stay safe